This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform. More about them later in the video. Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today's script was penned by Radu Alexander, so be sure to show him some love in the comments, and tell us whether you think the title for this video is accurate. Was Cicero the greatest statesman of ancient Rome? Let's find out. Poet Catullus described Cicero as the most eloquent of all the sons of Romulus, while Quintilian wrote that Cicero was regarded not as the name of a man, but as the name of eloquence itself. Famed for his oratorical skills without rival in the Roman world, Cicero is remembered today for his speeches on law, politics, and philosophy. But he was far more than a gifted writer and public speaker. Cicero was a key figure in the last decades of the Roman Republic. The three greatest attempts to overthrow the Republic all happened within his lifetime. He managed to escape the first one by Sulla unscathed. He was instrumental in stopping the second one by Catiline, and despite his best efforts, failed to prevent the third by Caesar, which saw Cicero's beloved Republic crumble to dust. Marcus Tullius Cicero, or Cicero, was born on January 3rd, 106 BC, in the Italian town of Arpinum, nowadays called Arpino, about 60 miles southeast of Rome. According to Plutarch, the main ancient source we have on the life of Cicero, the future statesman was descended from the Volci, an Italic tribe that used to be a real thorn in Rome's side during the early years of the Republic. After fighting for centuries, the Volscians were defeated and their territory was assimilated into the ever-growing Roman Republic around 300 BC. Fortunately for Cicero, the Volscians received full Roman citizenship in 188 BC, so by the time he came on the scene, he had the same rights as a regular Roman. That being said, some of his political opponents still tried to use the fact that Cicero was not a native Roman against him. Some things never change, with one of them deeming Cicero a naturalized immigrant, while another referred to his consulship as the reign of an alien. For his part, Cicero remained proud of being an Arpinate, although he downplayed his Volscian roots and referred to himself as a Roman. He wrote that he had two fatherlands, that of which he is a native and that which he is a citizen. He will never deny his allegiance to his native town, only he will never forget that Rome is his greater fatherland and that Arpinum is but a portion of Rome. Volscian or not, Cicero was born into a wealthy and privileged family, with his father part of the equestrian order. Not much is known about his mother, except that her name was Elvia, and according to Plutarch, she was well born and lived an honorable life. His father, meanwhile, supposedly traced his ancestry to Tullus Atticus, a king of the Volci tribe who once waged war against the Romans. The final member worth mentioning was the original Cicero, who gave him his surname. The name comes from Cicer, Latin for chickpea, and this ancestor gained the moniker because he had a cleft on the tip of his nose, making it look like a chickpea. Cicero was advised to change his name early in his career to something less legume-based, but he refused, stating instead that he would strive to make the name Cicero more illustrious than such names as Scaurus and Catullus. Since most of us have no idea who those two even were without Googling them, we argue that he succeeded. And Cicero certainly maintained a good humor regarding his surname. On one occasion, when he offered a silver plate as a tribute to the gods, he requested the craftsman to inscribe his first two names, Marcus and Tullus, but instead of Cicero, to engrave an image of a chickpea, thus making him a pioneer in the use of emojis. Cicero was a gifted student, described as fond of learning and fond of wisdom, capable of welcoming all knowledge and incapable of slighting any kind of literature or training. From a young age, Cicero showed a remarkable aptitude for poetry and oratory, and also began studying Roman law with the help of a prominent statesman named Mucius Scaevola. However, a full Roman education could not be completed without military service. Therefore, in 90 BC, the 17-year-old Cicero went to fight in the Social War, which has nothing to do with Facebook and Twitter, first under Pompeius Strabo, Pompey the Great's father, and then under Sulla. The Social War occurred between the Roman Republic and some of its Italian allies, who, just like the Volci tribe a century earlier, wanted to receive Roman citizenship. The Romans won, although we don't know of any particulars of the war involving Cicero. It doesn't seem like he spent much time in the army, though, because in 88 BC, Cicero was already back back home, learning from the greatest orators, statesmen, and philosophers that Rome and Greece had to offer. If you're a lawyer, writer, and orator like Cicero and you want your brand to be just as influential, then you're going to need a snazzy website. And the sponsor for today's video, Squarespace, has you covered. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform perfect for entrepreneurs with wares to sell, bloggers with a message to spread, and artists looking to reach the masses with their work. Whether you're just starting out or you're looking for a way to better manage your brand, Squarespace makes it easy for you to create beautiful, professional websites, engage with your audience, and make sure the right people are getting your message. And let me tell you, Cicero never had tools like these. Squarespace's Fluid Engine makes it easier than ever for pretty much anyone to dive in and make a beautiful website. Answer a few questions about the goals you'd like to accomplish with your site, choose a template, and get dragging and dropping elements onto your template. Drag and drop technology is also included in every Squarespace site. With Squarespace Blueprint and their brand new AI and SEO tools, you'll be able to create a fully personalized website using this guided design system. Choose from a professionally curated list of layout and design options and build a unique presence from the ground up. And with their SEO tools, you'll have all the tools you need so the algorithm will never leave you in the dust. And best of all, if you're selling stuff on your website, you'll be able to offer a simple yet seamless checkout experience with Squarespace's powerful tools. You'll be able to accept credit cards, PayPal, Apple Pay, and in eligible countries offer customers the option to buy now and pay later with Afterpay and ClearPay. Ready to get started? Check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/biographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now, back to the video. In 81 BC, the 25-year-old Cicero began his career as a lawyer, with his first appearance in court being the defense of a guy named Publius Quinctius. But it was a different case 1 year later that earned him acclaim, fame, and some powerful enemies. At the time, Sulla had seized power in Rome following a civil war, but if you want to learn about that, check out the bio we have on Sulla. Once he was in charge, Sulla allowed his friends and supporters to enrich themselves through various shady dealings, such as, for example, acquiring property on the cheap from people who had been exiled or executed. That was the plan for a guy named Chrysogonus, who bought at auction the house of a deceased man from Ameria named Sextus Roscius. For the lavish countryside estate, Chrysogonus paid the low sum of 2,000 denarii, but in came the man's son and heir, also named Sextus Roscius, who publicly decried the auction as a sham, as the property was worth 250 talents, which was, to put it simply, a crapload more than what Chrysogonus paid for it. Angered that their actions would be called into question, Chrysogonus accused Roscius of killing his father, and Sulla indicted him on trumped-up evidence. Most lawyers wanted nothing to do with the trial out of fear of what Sulla might do to them. But wasn't there anyone willing to take the case and fight for justice? In came Marcus Cicero, ace attorney at law. Despite his lack of experience, Cicero delivered an impassioned speech where he accused Chrysogonus of being the mastermind behind the murder of Sextus Roscius, the elder, and the frame-up of his son to get his hands on the deceased man's fortune. But you know what? He was a lot better at this than we are, so let's see what Cicero had to say. Chrysogonus asks you, gentlemen of the jury, that for as much as he has made himself master of so ample a fortune which belongs by right to another man, and for as much as he is hindered and hampered in the enjoyment of that fortune by the fact that Sextus Roscius lives, he asks you, I say, to relieve his mind from every shade of doubt and anxiety. While Roscius is a citizen, he does not think that he can keep hold of Roscius's rich and splendid inheritance. If only Roscius be condemned and cast forth from society, then he hopes that he may be able to squander in luxury and profusion that which he has won by crime. He begs you, gentlemen, to pluck from his bosom this rooted distrust which frets and plagues him night and day, and to lend yourselves to secure him his ill-gotten gain. There's a lot more to it. But in short, Cicero urged the jury not to fall for Chrysogonus' scheme and to acquit Sextus Roscius, and guess what? They did. The defendant walked off a free man, and Cicero became the Perry Mason of the Roman world. However, Roscius was only cleared of patricide. We don't know if he ever got his family estate back or what happened to him or Chrysogonus after the trial. But what about Cicero? Surely now the high-profile cases would start flooding in. Well, not exactly, because after this victory, Cicero decided to take an extended leave from the bar and travel to Greece and Asia Minor. Some argued this was because he feared repercussions from Sulla, although Cicero wrote that he did it for health concerns due to overexertion and strain of the lungs. Either way, he spent 2 years away from Rome. Once he returned in 77 BC, Sulla was dead, the Republic had mostly been restored to its old ways, and Cicero was again ready to resume his promising career. It didn't take long for Cicero to become a rising star again. Despite his 2-year absence, he was still well regarded and was appointed quaestor in 76 BC, assigned to Sicily, where his main duty was to ensure that the grain kept flowing to Rome. He kept practicing law while in Sicily, and his most high-profile case involved the successful prosecution of the ex-governor of Sicily, Gaius Verus, another of Sulla's former supporters who stood accused of extortion. Once back in Rome, Cicero was promoted to more important political and administrative positions, in progression usually referred to as cursus honorum. He was already a member of the Senate thanks to his status as quaestor, and in 69 BC he was elected as aedile, and then in 66 BC as praetor. Only one position remained, that of consul. During the Roman Republic, the consulship was the highest elected office in the land. The consuls served for a term of 1 year, and they were always elected 2 at a time, so there would never be a single man who held all the power. It was possible to be consul more than once, although Cicero served only 1 term in 63 BC alongside a politician named Gaius Antonius Hybrida. Although the 2 consuls were technically equal, Cicero was definitely the guy in charge, with Hybrida described by others as a political non-entity and afraid of his own shadow, doing it strictly so he could score a governorship in a rich province after his 1 year in office. Little did either of them know that their consulship would be so eventful. For starters, Cicero had to navigate the tricky world of politics at a time when there were some pretty important players on the rise in Rome, mainly talking about Julius Caesar and Pompey, with Marcus Crassus as an honorable mention. A few years later, the three realized that together they would be unstoppable and formed an unofficial alliance dubbed the First Triumvirate. But for the moment, Pompey and Caesar were at odds with each other politically, and yes, we have bios on all 3 of them if you're interested. Wink. Also at odds were the 2 main political groups of Rome, informally dubbed the Optimatus and the Populares. The former were more traditional and backed Pompey, while the latter were populist in favor of Caesar, and in the middle of this brouhaha was the consul Cicero. He usually sided with the Optimatus, as he felt that the Populares resorted to demagoguery too often. Indeed, one of Cicero's first acts as consul was to oppose a bill put forward by an obscure tribune named Rullus, but really authored by Caesar. It was a plan to redistribute land among the poorer Romans, and on the face of it at least, it looked like something that would help the average citizens of Rome. However, Cicero objected to the fact that 10 men, or the 10 kings as he called them, would have complete control over the confiscation, resettlement, and redistribution of the lands, thus giving them unchecked power to sell off whatever property they desired across the provinces. 3 times was the bill put forward during his consulship, and all 3 times Cicero fought vehemently to have it vetoed. This hurt his standing with the common people, who perceived it as Cicero and the Optimatus striking down something that would help them, whereas the Populares were trying to look after their own interests. And indeed, it is likely that that was Caesar's intention all along. Ever a shrewd statesman, he came out on top whether the bill passed or not. But Caesar was not Cicero's biggest problem during his consulship, but rather one of his allies named Lucius Sergius Catilina. Catiline had previously stood for consulship 2 times unsuccessfully. After being rejected again by the voters in 63 BC, he began plotting a coup against the Republic. Catiline had the support of multiple senators, many of them crippled with debts that he promised to erase, and intended to use foreign armies to overthrow the consuls and take over the Republic by force. Unfortunately for him, Cicero found out about his plan. According to Plutarch, several former allies of Catiline that he tried to recruit, including Marcus Crassus, informed Cicero of the plot. With this new information, the consul called a meeting of the Senate on October 21st, 63 BC, and warned them that a rebellion was imminent. Everyone took the threat seriously and passed a decree that matters should be put in the hands of the consuls to preserve the city. Basically, this was martial law that gave Cicero the power to do whatever he deemed necessary to save the Republic. A few days later, Cicero may have avoided an assassination attempt on himself thanks to a woman named Fulvia, who informed him that two men named Marcius and Cethegus would come to his house to pay their respects. However, they were Catiline's men who were going to strike Cicero down with swords as soon as they were inside. The two men did indeed arrive the following morning, but they were not allowed inside the house despite their protests, so they just left. Whether or not they were truly assassins on Catiline's payroll, we cannot say with certainty. We might as well point out at this stage that most of our info about the Catiline conspiracy comes from the speeches of Cicero himself, and he has occasionally been accused of exaggerating the threat to the Republic and his role in preventing it to boost his reputation.
Slow down, drama queen.
As far as Catiline was concerned, he was allowed to speak before the Senate to defend himself, but no one was buying what he was selling.
I'm not buying it. Now get away from here.
After his speech, Cicero banished him from the city, and Catiline left and joined his army, which was waiting in Etruria. Cicero delegated duties. He stayed in Rome to deal with a threat in the city, while his fellow consul Hybrida, assisted by the more capable Quintus Metellus, would ride out and face the enemy in battle. Believe it or not, Cicero had the more dangerous task ahead of him, because one of Catiline's allies named Lentulus intended to kill all the senators and as many of the other citizens as they could to burn down the city itself and to spare no one. It was a stroke of luck that Cicero found out about this plan, because Lentulus tried to recruit a Gallic tribe called the Allobroges to their side. He intercepted the Gallic envoys and made them send a fake reply to Lentulus requesting a written oath, signed and sealed, guaranteeing their alliance should the Allobroges help Catiline overthrow the Republic. Basically, Cicero asked the traitors to stamp a giant guilty sign on their foreheads, and guess what? They did. Lentulus replied as requested with the names and signatures of his co-conspirators, who were immediately arrested. Now came the controversial part: what to do with them? Cicero asked for input from the Senate. One group, led by Caesar, suggested life imprisonment, while another, led by Cato the Younger, demanded the death penalty. Both choices were illegal under Roman law, since the conspirators were Roman citizens condemned without a trial. A vote was cast and Cato won, even though ultimately it was Cicero's call. He went along with the Senate vote and ordered the men executed. The rest of the conspiracy quickly fell apart. Once word reached Catiline that the coup inside Rome didn't work, most of his men abandoned him. By the time he fought Hybrida at the Battle of Pistoria in January 62 BC, he only had a few thousand men remaining. Catiline was killed in battle, and his plot had failed. Cicero was hailed as a hero for saving the Republic. A few years later, his execution of the conspirators would come back to bite him in the ass, but for now, the people voted him the greatest honors ever conferred and called him the father of his country. For now, Cicero was the talk of the town, but once the serious crisis had been averted, it didn't take long for Rome to fill up with its typical political shenanigans again. In 60 BC, Cicero did himself no favors when he refused to join Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus in the first triumvirate that we mentioned earlier. Say what you will about the guy, but Cicero was a true believer in the principles of the Republic and didn't want any single entity to attain too much power, even if it was him. At least, not at the moment. Unfortunately, this left Cicero vulnerable to attacks from his political enemies, and one of them struck. His name was Publius Claudius, and he's probably best remembered for the Bona Dea scandal, where he supposedly dressed up as a woman to attend the secret rites for the goddess Bona Dea, which forbade the presence of men. Thanks mainly to the influence of Caesar and the money of Crassus, Claudius not only escaped the scandal unscathed, but was made tribune in 58 BC. Claudius hated Cicero, so as soon as he had the power, he passed a law that outlawed anyone who had put to death Roman citizens without a trial. Clearly, this was aimed at Cicero for his execution of the Catiline conspirators, and it worked. Cicero suddenly found himself without many allies, so without any protection, he left Rome in exile, and to add insult to injury, Claudius had his house torn down. Cicero stayed in exile for about a year and a half. It was a dark time for him, where he even wrote about contemplating suicide. Luckily for him, Claudius quickly got drunk with power and began opposing Pompey and then even Caesar. Consequently, Pompey put forward a petition to recall Cicero to Rome, and with Caesar's support, it was enthusiastically endorsed. Therefore, in August 57 BC, Cicero was back home, but with one major caveat. He had to crush those Republican ideals he held so dear and not make any more disparaging comments towards the members of the triumvirate, particularly Caesar. Humbled and submissive, Cicero agreed to the terms. Likely because he was kept on a leash, Cicero mostly stayed out of politics for the rest of the decade. On the bright side, he dedicated most of his time to writing, and this period was when he produced many of his greatest works, particularly his papers on rhetoric and philosophy. Then, in 51 BC, Cicero's servile demeanor was rewarded with a governorship in Cilicia. He was praised for the work he did in the province, and this could have been the start of his political comeback. Unfortunately for him, Caesar had declared war on the Republic. We've talked about this civil war from the perspective of Caesar, Pompey, Mark Antony, Brutus, and probably others, so we'll stick to the short version. In 49 BC, Julius Caesar refused the order of the Senate to give up his provinces and disband his army. Instead, he marched on Rome. His enemies, led by Pompey, abandoned the city to gather their forces. Cicero followed Pompey, but after the latter was defeated at the Battle of Pharsalus in August 48 BC, Cicero surrendered while others stayed on to fight. Back in Rome, Caesar pardoned Cicero, hoping to turn him into a reluctant ally because this would help legitimize his power grab. For his part, Cicero seemed somewhat willing to accept his role, not because he had any love or trust for Caesar, but because he had utterly lost confidence in the Republican side. However, whatever plans he had went out the window in 44 BC, when Caesar was assassinated during a meeting of the Senate by Brutus and dozens of other conspirators. Cicero himself had no part in the plot, although he certainly was a fan of it, writing in a letter to Gaius Trebonius, "How I could wish that you had invited me to that most glorious banquet on the Ides of March." After Caesar's death, Cicero became one of the leaders of the Republican faction, while the opposing Caesarians were led by Mark Antony, who was consul at the time. At first, the two sides seemed conciliatory. Cicero even proposed a compromise at a Senate meeting where Caesar's assassins would not be punished for their deed, but all the acts passed by Caesar as dictator would stay in place, and he would even receive a public funeral. The smiles and handshakes were just for show, though. Mark Antony had no intention of letting bygones be bygones. Instead, he provoked a new civil war later that year when he tried to take over Caesar's former governorships by force. Cicero saw this as a great opportunity to be rid of Antony forever and declared him an enemy of the state. Little did Cicero know that he doomed himself with that action. Mark Antony outplayed him, to be honest. He forged a new alliance with Marcus Lepidus and Caesar's heir, Octavian, thus forming the Second Triumvirate. Together, they grabbed power and enacted prescriptions like Sulla did before them. They assembled a list of hundreds of rich and influential men who would be executed and their properties confiscated, and Cicero was at the top of the list. Despite Octavian pleading for 2 days for Cicero's life because he respected the old man, Mark Antony refused to listen to any terms unless Cicero should be the first man to be put to death. And so he was. Cicero was at his villa in Tusculum when he heard of the prescriptions. He attempted to flee Italy, but bad weather turned his ship around. Eventually, Cicero accepted his fate. He returned to another villa in Caieta and awaited his executioners to track him down. They found him on December 7th, 43 BC. Among his assassins was Popilius, a tribune whose life Cicero once saved by defending him in a case of parricide. The 63-year-old former consul and statesman offered no resistance and even stretched out his neck so his killers would land a good swing. Cicero's head and hands were delivered to Antony in Rome, who had them nailed to the rostra for all Romans to see. Of course, things didn't work out too well for Antony either, as he was defeated by Octavian, who then took on the name of Augustus Caesar and became the first Roman emperor. Plutarch ends his tale of Cicero with an anecdote. One day, when Augustus visited his nephew, the boy tried to hide the fact that he was reading one of Cicero's books, but the emperor took the book and began reading from it himself. And when he returned it to the boy, he said of Cicero, "A learned man, my child, a learned man and a lover of his country." I hope you learned something today. And if you liked what you saw here today, be sure to deploy your likes, subscribe to the channel, and comment your favorite thing about Cicero or Cicero. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.